Thank you for joining us on Chill Sports History. Whether you're listening in the background, relaxing, winding down at the end of the day, or settling in to fall asleep, we're very happy to have you here with us. Tonight, we're looking back at the 2016 Chicago Cubs and how they finally broke a 108-year drought. Some sports stories stay interesting because of the players, some stay interesting because of the final score, and then there are stories like this one where the years themselves become part of the drama. By the time the 2016 season began, the number had become impossible to separate from the team. 108 years. The Cubs had last won the World Series in 1908. They had not even appeared in one since 1945. That meant the drought had lasted longer than almost any fan's lifetime. It had stretched past parents and grandparents, and for many families even further back than that. At a certain point, a drought like that stops feeling like a simple sports statistic. It becomes part of the identity of the team. It changes the way people talk. It changes the way people hope. It changes the way every good season is measured, because no matter how promising things look, there is always the sense that the real question still has not been answered. The Cubs lived with that for a very long time. Sometimes it was talked about lightly, almost like a family joke. Sometimes it was discussed with real pain. But it was always there. It sat behind the franchise, behind Wrigley Field, behind every new summer that began with optimism and ended without the final reward. That is part of what made the Cubs different from many other teams. They were not only measured by wins and losses, they were measured against memory, against time, against all the people who had loved the team and never seen the ending they wanted. And baseball is the kind of sport that makes those feelings linger. It is a sport of long summers, familiar routines, old ballparks, and stories that get told again and again. So the Cubs came to feel tied to that sort of long memory more than most teams ever do. Baseball gives people a lot of time to think. It is played over long summers, it returns almost every day, it becomes part of the background of family life, part of the sound of a city, part of the feeling of a season moving along. That is one reason certain teams gather so much emotion around them. People do not only watch them, they grow up with them. The Cubs were one of those teams. For generations, they had been easy to care about and hard to explain. The ballpark was beautiful. The setting was familiar. The fan base stayed loyal. And yet, the ending people wanted never seemed to arrive. That combination gave the team a very specific kind of identity. They were loved deeply, remembered constantly, and still somehow unfinished. By 2016, that unfinished feeling had become one of the most recognizable parts of the franchise. Even people who did not follow baseball closely usually knew the basic outline. The Cubs had not won in a very long time. The weight had become part of the team's public face. That meant every good Cubs season carried two timelines at once. There was the season itself, and then there was the long shadow of everything that had come before it. Wrigley Field seemed to hold some of that feeling too. The ivy on the walls, the day games, the neighborhood around the stadium, the sense that baseball there still moved to an older rhythm. The Cubs did not just play in Chicago. They played inside one of the most recognizable settings in sports, and that setting carried all the old hope with it. But by 2016, this was no longer a story about a lovable team simply hoping to get lucky. This was a very good team. That matters, because it changes the shape of everything. The Cubs were not a miracle from nowhere. They were not some surprise visitor arriving late to October. They had been built carefully, and by the start of 2016, they looked like one of the most complete teams in baseball. That process had taken time. Theo Epstein had been brought in to oversee a real rebuild. The goal was not just to make the Cubs respectable again. The goal was to build a team that could truly contend. Slowly, the roster began to take shape. Anthony Rizzo became one of the centerpieces. Chris Bryant arrived and looked like a star almost immediately. Javier Baez brought rare energy and talent. Addison Russell added another gifted young infielder. Kyle Schwarber brought power and presence. Around them, the Cubs kept adding pieces that made the whole group feel deeper and steadier. Then Joe Maddon arrived as manager, and that helped set the tone. Maddon brought experience, calm, and a certain looseness that suited a young club very well. He did not make the Cubs careless. He made them seem unafraid. For a team that was going to be asked sooner or later to carry an enormous amount of pressure, that mattered a great deal. In 2015, the Cubs took a major step forward. They won 97 games, reached the National League Championship Series, and suddenly looked like more than a promising project. They lost to the Mets, but the larger message was clear. The Cubs were close. That changed the emotional setting going into 2016. Hope was still part of it, of course. Hope is always part of it. But now hope was joined by expectation. People were not just dreaming about the Cubs doing something special someday. They were looking at this particular roster and thinking maybe the time had finally come. Chicago believed it could win the World Series, and from the start of the season, the Cubs played like a team that believed it too. The roster had balance almost everywhere. Ben Zobrist gave them experience and steadiness. Jason Hayward brought elite defense and another veteran voice. John Lester was already there. Jake Arrieta was still one of the most overpowering pitchers in baseball. Kyle Hendricks was becoming even more important than people outside Chicago may have realized. John Lackey added another experienced arm. The lineup had stars. The defense was excellent. There was no obvious soft spot. Then, very early in the season, the Cubs lost Kyle Schwarber to a serious knee injury. It was the sort of thing that could have felt ominous. On another team, maybe it would have. On an older version of the Cubs, maybe it would have seemed like the first sign that trouble was on the way. But one of the first clear signs that the 2016 Cubs were different was the way they absorbed that loss and kept moving. They did not fall apart. They did not begin to look fragile. They just kept winning. And not in only one way. That was one of the most reassuring things about them all season. They could win a clean pitching game. They could win behind a burst of offense. They could rely on defense and shorten innings. They could look explosive one night and controlled the next. Dexter Fowler gave them energy at the top of the order. Rizzo remained one of the emotional centers of the club. Bryant kept growing into the role of franchise star. Zobrist fit in naturally. Baez brought quickness, daring, and the feeling that something unusual might happen whenever he was involved. Russell helped keep the infield sharp. Hayward, even in a difficult offensive season, still gave the team real value with his glove and presence. And the pitching gave the Cubs a calm structure beneath all of it. Lester felt like exactly what he was, a veteran who had seen pressure before. Arrieta still had the force to take over a game. Hendricks gave them something quieter and just as valuable. He was precise, thoughtful, and understated. He did not pitch like someone trying to overpower the world. He pitched like someone solving problems. Across a long season, that matters. So does defense, and the Cubs had plenty of it. Great defensive teams can make games feel subtly unfair, not because they are flashy all the time, but because they turn dangerous moments into routine outs. They steal confidence a little at a time, they help pitchers get off the field, they make rallies harder to build. The Cubs did that all year. There was also something reassuring about the way the season felt from a distance. Some great teams look frantic even when they are winning. They rely on constant drama. They always seem to be escaping something. The Cubs did not feel like that most of the time. They felt steady. They felt like a team that usually understood what kind of game it was in. If the night called for patience, they could be patient. If it called for power, they had power. If it called for pitching and defense, they could win that way too. That is often what makes a long regular season feel convincing. A team stops looking hot and starts looking dependable. That dependability mattered because of who the Cubs were. For another franchise, a strong regular season might simply build confidence. For the Cubs, it also built tension. The better they looked, the more people began to picture October. The more people pictured October, the more the old history returned. And still, Chicago kept winning. That is what made the season so unusual. The Cubs were carrying all that expectation, and yet for most of the year they did not look burdened by it. They looked like a team with talent, depth, and enough self-belief to let the season unfold without rushing it. There is something calm about that in memory now, not because the season lacked pressure, but because the team rarely seemed ruled by it. As the season settled into summer, Chicago started to feel less like an exciting story and more like the standard everyone else had to chase. They were not simply winning often, they looked like a team that had answers. That did not mean the season was perfect. No baseball team moves in a straight line for 6 months. There were quieter stretches. There were games when the offense did not do enough. There were weeks when they looked a little more ordinary. But those ordinary stretches never seemed to reveal one fatal weakness. The Cubs still had too much talent, too much depth, and too much balance. That is often what separates a very good team from a great one. A great team does not need everything to go perfectly every night. It just needs enough ways to win. Bryant especially began to feel central to the whole season. He had power, patience, athleticism, and an easy star quality. By the end of the year, he would win the National League Most Valuable Player award, and it felt like a natural result. Rizzo remained just as important in a different way. If Bryant was one of the brightest faces of the team, Rizzo often felt like its emotional heartbeat. He played with a kind of firmness that suited the whole roster. And then there was Hendricks, whose season had a quiet beauty to it. On a staff with louder names, he finished with the best earned run average in the majors. He did it with control, movement, timing, and calm. By September, the Cubs had separated themselves so clearly that they clinched the National League Central early. That is usually the sign of a real powerhouse. They had not merely survived the season, they had controlled it. When the regular season ended, the Cubs had won 103 games, best in baseball. And still, the only question anyone truly cared about had not yet been answered. Could the Cubs do it in October? That was where the story always became heavier. A long drought changes the emotional shape of success. A great regular season does not only create excitement, it creates new ways to worry. The better the team looks, the more painful it will feel if the ending still goes wrong. So when the postseason arrived, the Cubs entered it not just as contenders, but as favorites. Their first opponent was the San Francisco Giants in the National League Division Series. The Cubs won Game 1, then they won Game 2. At first, the series looked like a favorite taking care of business. Chicago protected home field. The pitching was good, the margin felt solid. One more win and they would move on. Then came Game 3, and the game stretched deep into the night before the Giants finally won in 13 innings. That sort of loss can change the emotional temperature very quickly. The series score may still look fine on paper, but the neat feeling of control has slipped away. A long, extra inning loss has a way of staying in the room with a team. Game 4 carried some of that unease with it. Late in the game, the Cubs were trailing. It became easy to imagine the series slipping back to Chicago tide, with all the old anxiety that would bring. For a franchise with their history, moments like that rarely feel small. But the Cubs did something important there. They stayed calm enough to keep playing. In the 9th inning, Chicago rallied. They kept taking their chances. They kept leaning on the game until the opening appeared. Then they moved through it. The Cubs came back, won Game 4, and took the series. That mattered for more than the obvious reason. October had already become uncomfortable, and the Cubs had not tightened into old habits. They had come through the first real wave of tension and kept going. Next came the Dodgers in the National League Championship Series. This one began badly. Los Angeles won Game 1 at Wrigley Field. Then the Dodgers won Game 2 as well, including a 1-0 game that made the Cubs look, at least for a moment, a little trapped. Now Chicago was down 2-0, and the mood around the series tightened immediately. That is the sort of spot where an old story can begin trying to reassert itself. For Cubs fans, it would have been very easy to wonder whether the regular season was about to become another setup for disappointment. The Cubs had spent months looking like the best team in baseball. But in October, fear can make 2 losses feel much larger than they are. Once the series shifted to Los Angeles, though, the Cubs changed the tone. They won Game 3, then they won Game 4. The offense loosened up. The lineup began to breathe again. Their at-bats looked freer. The team seemed to find its rhythm. Their pitching kept doing its job, and now the bats were helping too. Momentum had turned. That shift mattered because playoff series can start to feel larger than they really are. A team loses the first 2 games, and suddenly everything begins to sound final. Every weakness seems bigger. Every mistake seems like proof of some deeper problem. The Cubs had to resist that feeling, and they did. Once the series moved west, they looked more settled. Not perfect, but settled. Their swings looked more natural. Their at-bats seemed less rushed. The whole team seemed to play with a little more space around it. Sometimes that is all a strong team needs, not a miracle, just enough space to become itself again. That is what makes this stretch of the story important. It was not only that the Cubs won those games, it was the way the series reminded them what kind of team they were. They did not need to become a different club in October. They just needed to keep being the one they had already been for months. By the time the series turned back in Chicago's favor, the old tension had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. The Cubs no longer looked like a team in danger of getting swallowed by its own history. They looked like a team learning how to carry it. By the time the later games of the series arrived, the Cubs looked much more like themselves again. They did not look frightened by the pressure. They looked like a very good team rediscovering its pace. That is one of the most important traits of a great team. Not that it never looks uncomfortable, but that it can return to itself after discomfort arrives. In Game 6, Kyle Hendricks took the mound with a chance to send the Cubs to the World Series. There is something fitting about that. Hendricks was not the loudest star on the roster, but he represented so much of what made the team work. Calm, precise, unhurried, effective. He was excellent. The Cubs won 5-0. And with that, Chicago won the National League pennant. For the first time since 1945, the Cubs were going to the World Series. That fact deserved a pause. Before they could end the drought, they first had to do something generations of Cubs fans had not seen at all. Now they had reached the World Series, and waiting there was Cleveland. That gave the matchup a certain symmetry. This was not one long-suffering team against a modern power. It was two franchises with their own histories of waiting, and that made the World Series feel heavy right from the start. Game 1 went to Cleveland, Game 2 went to Chicago. For a moment, the Cubs seemed to have steadied themselves. Then the series moved to Cleveland, and the pressure deepened. The Indians won Game 3. Then they won Game 4. Now the Cubs were down 3-1 in the World Series. That was the moment when the whole season began to feel very narrow. After 103 wins, after all those months of looking like the best team in baseball, Chicago was suddenly one loss from seeing it all end without the title. And because it was the Cubs, because 108 years was always nearby, the situation felt even heavier. It did not just feel like a team facing elimination. It felt like a team trying to hold off history itself one more time. At that point, the Cubs did not need to think about the whole story. They just needed one win. Game 5 gave them that. John Lester started. Aroldis Chapman played a huge role. The Cubs won 3-2 and kept the season alive. That first survival game is often the hardest. It does not solve everything. It just delays the ending. But delay can matter. One win can change the emotional weather of a series. Then came Game 6, and Chicago played one of its most complete games of the year. Jake Arrieta pitched well. Addison Russell hit a grand slam. Chris Bryant had 4 hits. The Cubs won 9-3. Now, after trailing 3-1, they had pushed the World Series all the way to a Game 7, and Game 7 in the World Series is already one of the most tense things in sports. Game 7 with the Cubs trying to end a 108-year drought felt even larger than that. So the story came down to one final game in Cleveland. One last chance. One last set of outs. One last night for the Cubs to either move beyond their history or add another chapter to it. And in the very first inning, they gave themselves a beautiful start. Dexter Fowler led off the game with a home run. That mattered beyond the score. A leadoff homer in a game like that cuts through nerves. It tells a team immediately that it does not have to spend the whole night reacting. It can strike first. Chicago kept adding from there. They built a lead, they created space. For stretches, it looked as though the Cubs might find a relatively calm path to the finish. One of the most memorable moments came from David Ross. Ross was playing the final game of his career. He was a veteran, beloved in the clubhouse, and one of those players who often seem to matter in ways the box score does not fully measure. In Game 7 of the World Series, in the last game of his major league career, he hit a home run. It was one of those details that makes a sports story feel almost novel-like. The old catcher, the final game, the biggest stage the franchise had seen in generations. And yet even that did not settle things. Cleveland was not done. And that is a huge part of why this story still lives the way it does. If the Cubs had simply coasted to the last out, the title would still have mattered, but it would not have become one of the defining championship games people remember so clearly now. Instead, the game tightened. Cleveland kept pressing, Chicago kept trying to hold on. Then, in the 8th inning, Rajai Davis hit the dramatic home run that tied the game at 6. Just like that, all the fear was back. The whole emotional shape of the night changed in one swing. The Cubs had been close to the finish line. Now they were back in open water, tied in the late innings of Game 7, with the weight of everything hanging over them again. All year long, the Cubs had been answering the question of whether they were strong enough to carry all that history. Now, in the most painful possible moment, they had to answer it again. The game stayed tied after 9 innings. Then came the rain delay. That pause became one of the most memorable parts of the whole World Series because it created such a strange stillness in the middle of chaos. Game 7 was tied in extra innings. The Cubs were 3 outs from a title and 3 outs from heartbreak. Then, suddenly, everyone had to stop. The noise had to settle. The players had to sit with themselves. The game, for a few minutes, stopped moving. And that pause now feels like one of the quietest moments in the whole story. For the Cubs, that delay may have been exactly what they needed. It gave them a chance to breathe, a chance to gather themselves, a chance to remember that the story was not gone yet. That pause has become so memorable partly because it gave the whole game a strange second life. Before the delay, everything felt loud and unstable. The Rajai Davis home run had changed the mood completely. The Cubs had gone from feeling close to the finish to feeling as though the whole season might be slipping out of their hands. Then the rain came, and the game stopped asking for an answer. For a few minutes there was nothing to do except wait. That almost never happens in a moment like that. Usually a team has to keep going, keep reacting, keep living inside the noise of the game. Here, the Cubs were given a small pocket of silence in the middle of the biggest night they had played in generations. And when you think about the story as a whole, that quiet moment almost feels necessary. A team had spent all year carrying 108 years of noise, decades of losing, decades of memory, decades of people saying maybe this year, and then watching the answer become no again. Then, in the biggest game, on the most tense night, they were suddenly given one small chance to be still. It did not win the game for them, but it gave them a moment to breathe like something more than history. It gave them a moment to simply be a baseball team again. When play resumed in the 10th inning, Chicago came out ready. Kyle Schwarber, back with the team in the World Series after that awful knee injury early in the season, reached base. That in itself was remarkable. A player who had seemed lost in April was now helping set up the most important inning of the year in November. Then came Ben Zobrist. Zobrist had spent the whole season doing steady and winning things. He was experienced, smart, versatile, and calm in exactly the way a team wants a veteran to be. In the 10th inning of Game 7, he hit the tie-breaking double. It was not wild or theatrical. It was just clean, sharp, and enormous. Exactly the right swing from exactly the right kind of player. The Cubs added another run after that and moved ahead 8-6. Even there, with the lead back in their hands, nothing felt settled. That may be the truest thing about the whole night. The Cubs never really got to enjoy the feeling of being safe. Every time the game seemed to open up, it tightened again. Every time the finish line appeared, it seemed to move a little farther away. That is part of why the ending stayed with people so strongly. The Cubs did not win by drifting into history. They had to keep stepping toward it, one difficult moment after another. By then, the game had become larger than strategy alone. Of course, the baseball details still mattered. Every pitch mattered. Every base runner mattered. But the emotional weight had grown so large that the final innings seemed to be carrying much more than one championship. They were carrying the whole backlog of Cubs feeling, all at once. and somehow the Cubs were still there inside it, still steady enough to finish. Even then, the game refused to become easy. Cleveland scored in the bottom of the 10th and cut the lead to 8-7. Chicago still had to get the last outs. It still had to finish the hardest game it had played in generations. And finally, it did. When the final out was recorded, the Cubs had won the World Series. Not easily, not gently, and not with the smooth and quiet ending anyone might have wished for. They won it through pressure, mistakes, recoveries, momentum swings, and one last push after the game seemed to be getting away from them. In some ways, that made the ending feel even more fitting. A franchise carrying that much history was never likely to end the drought in a simple game. Of course, it had to go to extra innings in Game 7. Of course, it had to ask the Cubs to stare into their worst fear one last time before letting them move beyond it. The final score was 8-7 in 10 innings. The Cubs had won the World Series 4-3. The drought was over. For the first time since 1908, the Chicago Cubs were champions. That is why the ending felt bigger than an ordinary title. This was not just a baseball team celebrating a championship. It was a city exhaling. It was families thinking about parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents who had waited so long and never seen it. It was the end of an old ache that had lived inside the franchise for more than a century. Ben Zobrist was named World Series Most Valuable Player. Chris Bryant finished the year as National League Most Valuable Player. But what most people remember first is still the team itself. They remember the roster that had been built carefully. They remember the 103 wins. They remember how complete the Cubs looked in the regular season. They remember the tense comeback against San Francisco. They remember the recovery against Los Angeles. They remember falling behind Cleveland 3-1 and still finding a way back. And above all, they remember Game 7, Fowler leading off with a home run, David Ross in the last game of his career, Rajai Davis tying it, the rain delay, Zobrist in the 10th, the final outs. That is why the 2016 Cubs still feel so easy to revisit. A lot of championship teams are impressive. This one felt historic before it was even finished. It carried memory with it. It carried expectation with it. And at the end, it gave one of the most famous franchises in sports the one thing it had been missing for 108 years. The Chicago Cubs had finally done it. They were no longer the team still waiting. They were champions. Thank you for spending some time with us. I hope you enjoyed this look back at how the Chicago Cubs broke a 108-year drought, and we'd be very happy to have you here again for another story soon. I hope you have a great day or night, and we'll hopefully see you again soon on Chill Sports History.